The air inside the city does not smell of spring. It smells of sulfur, ancient dust, and the sour reek of terrified sweat. It is the morning of May 29, 1453, and the sun has barely begun to bleed over the horizon of the Bosphorus. Inside the great church of Hagia Sophia, the chanting of the liturgy struggles to rise above the distant, rhythmic thumping of war drums that seem to beat in time with the racing hearts of the citizens. For over 1,000 years, the Theodosian Walls have been the ultimate shield of Christendom, a triple-layered stone guarantee that the Roman Empire would survive any storm. But today, those walls are not just cracked, they are weeping. The stone is pulverized, the mortar turned to dust, and the defenders standing atop them are no longer looking at an army. They are looking at an ocean of steel and fire. Picture the scene from the vantage point of a Genoese crossbowman on the ramparts. Below him, the earth is literally disappearing under the feet of 80,000 Ottoman soldiers. The silence before the dawn attack is heavier than the bombardment itself. He knows, and Emperor Constantine XI knows, that the end of the Middle Ages is waiting just outside the gate. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this catastrophe, we cannot start at the end. We must understand why this city, a golden jewel that once commanded the envy of the known world, was left to die alone. By the mid-15th century, the Roman Empire was a ghost. It was no longer the master of the Mediterranean. It was a city-state, a head without a body, surrounded entirely by the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. The man destined to sever this head was a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II. History often paints him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, but the truth is far more complex and terrifying. Mehmed was a scholar, a polymath who spoke multiple languages, studied the biographies of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and possessed a cold, mathematical intellect that frightened even his own advisors. When he ascended the throne, the courts of Europe laughed. They called him a child, an inexperienced boy who would crumble under the weight of his father's legacy. They sent gifts of insult and condescension, believing the Ottoman threat had passed with the death of Sultan Mehmed II. This was the fatal miscalculation of the Christian world. They mistook youth for weakness and silence for submission. Mehmed did not want tribute. He did not want a truce. He wanted the red apple. He wanted the capital of the world. He famously swore that there was only one empire, one faith, and one sovereignty in the world, and that seat of power had to be Constantinople. To take it, he would have to do what 24 armies before him had failed to do. He would have to break the unbreakable. But here is what the chronicles often downplay. The psychological warfare began long before the first arrow flew. Mehmed knew that to kill the city, he first had to strangle it. In 1452, a year before the siege, he began the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from his grandfather's fortress on the Asian side. He called it Rumeli Hisari, but the soldiers had a different name for it. Bagakizan, the throat cutter. It was a masterstroke of strategic cruelty. With this fortress complete, Mehmed controlled the flow of grain and aid from the Black Sea. He had his hands around the windpipe of Constantinople, and he began to squeeze. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologus watched the construction with a growing sense of doom. Constantine was a capable, brave man, a soldier emperor in an age that had no use for them. He sent ambassadors to the Sultan, begging for peace, offering increased tribute. Mehmed's response was to execute the ambassadors. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation. There would only be surrender or death. Constantine turned his eyes west, sending desperate pleas to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa. "The city of cities is in peril," he wrote. But Europe was fractured, exhausted by its own wars, and deeply divided by the religious schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. The Pope demanded the reunification of the churches as the price for aid, a price the proud citizens of Constantinople refused to pay. "Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara," some of the Grand Dukes famously whispered. So, when the Ottoman vanguard finally appeared on the horizon in April 1453, Constantinople stood almost entirely alone. Against Mehmed's 80,000 regulars and thousands of irregulars, Constantine could muster only 7,000 men. Picture that disparity. 7,000 men to defend 12 miles of walls. That is less than one man for every 4 feet of stone. Among these defenders, however, was a glimmer of hope. A specialist contingent of roughly 700 Genoese mercenaries had arrived, led by Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, an expert in siege defense. He brought with him modern armor, professional discipline, and a tactical brilliance that would prove to be the only reason the city survived as long as it did. But Mehmed had brought something else, something the world had never seen before. During the winter, a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had previously offered his services to Constantine but was rejected because the emperor couldn't pay him, turned to the Sultan. He told Mehmed, "I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity of the stone. I have examined the walls of the city in great detail. I can shatter them." Mehmed asked only one question: "Can you cast it?" Orban said yes. The result was the basilica, a cannon so massive it required 60 oxen and 400 men just to move it. It was 27 feet long and fired a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds. When they tested it in Edirne, the sound was heard 10 miles away. On April 6, 1453, the bombardment began. This was the moment warfare changed forever. For centuries, siege warfare was a contest of patience: starve them out or scale the walls. Mehmed chose brute force. The basilica and its smaller cousins pounded the walls day and night. The psychological impact was devastating. The chroniclers tell us that the ground shook as if in an earthquake. Women fainted in the streets from the concussive force. The ancient masonry, which had withstood Goths, Avars, and Arabs, began to crumble. But the defenders were tenacious. Every night, under the cover of darkness, Giustiniani and his men would rush to the breach, filling the gaps with rubble, bales of wool, and timber, creating soft barriers that absorbed the cannonballs better than rigid stone. Mehmed grew frustrated. The walls were breaking, yes, but they were not falling fast enough. And on the water, he faced humiliation. The Golden Horn, the primary harbor of the city, was blocked by a massive iron chain stretched across the entrance. His navy, though vast, was useless if it couldn't penetrate the harbor to attack the weaker seawalls. Then, on April 20th, disaster struck the Ottoman morale. 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese, and 1 Byzantine transport carrying grain and weapons appeared in the Sea of Marmara. Mehmed ordered his entire fleet to intercept them. It should have been a massacre. Hundreds of Ottoman galleys swarmed the 4 tall European ships. But the winds favored the tall ships. From their high decks, the armored Genoese sailors rained death down upon the lower Ottoman galleys. They chopped the boarding hands, threw Greek fire, and smashed the oars of the Turkish vessels. Sultan Mehmed, watching from the shore, was apoplectic. He rode his horse into the surf, screaming at his admiral, Balta Olu, cursing him, demanding he take the ships at any cost. It was in vain. The 4 ships broke through the blockade and slipped safely behind the great chain into the Golden Horn. The city erupted in cheers. For a brief moment, they believed God was still on their side. In the Ottoman camp, the mood was funereal. The Janissaries grumbled. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had always opposed the siege, urged the Sultan to retreat before a European crusade army arrived. This was the crisis point. A lesser man would have packed up. A lesser man would have listened to the logic of the situation. But Mehmed possessed a lateral thinking ability that bordered on madness. He looked at the chain blocking the harbor, and he realized, if he could not sail around the chain, he would go over the land. In one of the most audacious military engineering feats in history, Mehmed ordered the construction of a greased wooden road stretching over the steep hill of Galata. He mobilized thousands of men and oxen. Over the course of a single night, 70 Ottoman ships were hauled out of the water, pulled up the hill by brute muscle and leverage, and slid down the other side into the Golden Horn. Imagine the horror of the Byzantine defenders the next morning. They went to sleep secure in the knowledge that their northern flank was safe behind the chain. They woke up to find the Ottoman fleet sitting inside their harbor, guns trained on the vulnerable sea walls. The strategic equation had collapsed overnight. The defenders now had to stretch their thin line even thinner. The siege dragged on through May. The Ottoman engineers tried to mine underneath the walls, digging tunnels to collapse the towers. But the Byzantines had their own expert, a Scot named John Grant, who led countermining operations. They located the Turkish tunnels by placing bowls of water on the ground and watching for ripples caused by the digging. They intercepted the Ottoman miners underground, fighting vicious, claustrophobic battles in the dark with knives and Greek fire, collapsing the tunnels on top of their enemies. By late May, both sides were exhausted. Inside the city, food was scarce. The icons were paraded through the streets, but the omens were terrifying. A thick fog descended on the city, an impossibility in late May. A strange red light was seen glowing around the dome of the Hagia Sophia. Some said it was the Holy Spirit leaving the city. Others said it was a reflection of the fires of hell. On May 26th, Mehmed held a final war council. The Grand Vizier Halil Pasha made one last plea for peace, warning that the Italian states were surely mobilizing a rescue fleet. But the younger generals and the Sultan's spiritual advisors urged war. Mehmed made his decision. The city, he told them, or the sword. He ordered a day of rest and prayer on May 28th. Silence fell over the Ottoman camp. It was the silence of a gathered storm. Mehmed rode among his men, promising them everything. To the erratic troops, he promised loot. To the devout, he promised martyrdom and paradise. To the ambitious, he promised governorships. I reserve for myself only the buildings and the walls, he proclaimed. Everything else, the treasures, the captives, is yours. Inside the city, the mood was one of terminal resignation. Emperor Constantine XI held a final service in the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Latin, united by fear, prayed together for the last time. The emperor went to each of his commanders, asking for forgiveness if he had ever wronged them. It was a scene of weeping and embracing, the funeral rites of an empire enacted by the living. Then the sun went down, and the darkness of May 29th settled in. At 1:30 in the morning, the noise began. It wasn't the rhythmic bombardment this time, it was a human roar. Mehmed sent in his first wave, the Bashi Bazauks. These were irregulars, mercenaries, and conscripts, ill-equipped and poorly armored. Their job was not to take the wall. Their job was to die. Their job was to exhaust the defenders. For 2 hours, the defenders on the walls slaughtered them. Arrows, rocks, and crossbow bolts rained down. The moat filled with bodies. The Bashi Bazauks tried to retreat, but the Ottoman military police whipped them back toward the walls. They were caught between the Byzantine steel and the Sultan's wrath. As the first wave receded, leaving thousands of dead, the defenders barely had time to catch their breath before the second wave hit. These were the Anatolian regulars, disciplined, armored, and organized. They brought ladders and grappling hooks. The fighting became hand-to-hand on the ramparts. The noise was deafening, the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, the roar of the cannons blasting point-blank into the melee. Constantine and Giustiniani were everywhere, plugging gaps, shouting orders, rallying their exhausted men. For hours they held. Miraculously, against all odds, the line was holding. The sun began to rise. The Ottoman attack seemed to be stalling. But Mehmed had one card left to play. The Janissaries. The Sultan's elite household guard, the finest infantry in the world, had been held in reserve. Fresh, perfectly armored, and fanatically loyal, they advanced in perfect silence to the beat of a single drum. This silence was more terrifying than the screaming of the irregulars. They marched up to the moat, where the bodies of their comrades were piled so high they served as a bridge. At the same time, a tragic accident occurred. A small tactical gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlocked after a sortie. A handful of Turks discovered it and rushed into the courtyard behind the main wall. They raised an Ottoman flag on a tower. It was a small incursion, easily containable, but the psychological effect was catastrophic. The defenders looked back and saw the enemy flag flying behind them. The cry went up, "The city is taken! The city is taken!" In the chaos, disaster struck the leadership. Giovanni Giustiniani, the backbone of the defense, was hit. A shot pierced his armor, shattering his chest or leg. Bleeding profusely and in shock, he asked to be taken off the wall. Constantine begged him, "My brother, do not leave us. Your wound is slight." But Giustiniani's nerve broke. He was carried away to a ship. When the defenders saw the Genoese commander leave, their morale collapsed. The Janissaries saw the hesitation. With a roar of "Allah, Allah," they surged forward. They climbed the stockades. A giant of a Janissary named Hazen was the first up, hacking his way through the Greeks before being cut down, but 10 more took his place. The levee broke. The Emperor, Constantine XI, saw that the end had come. He stripped off his purple imperial ornaments so he could not be distinguished from a common soldier. Drawing his sword, he shouted, "The city has fallen, and I am still alive." With his handful of loyal guards, he charged directly into the oncoming flood of Janissaries. He was never seen again. He died as Rome died fighting. By noon, the blood in the streets ran so thick it was said to float bodies out to sea. The Ottoman troops poured into the city like a river bursting a dam. They made for the Hagia Sophia, battering down the great bronze doors. Inside, the terrified population was huddling in prayer. The looting began. Mehmed waited until the afternoon to enter the city. He rode his white horse through the Carisius gate. He rode past the lifeless bodies of the men who had defied him. He rode straight to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted, sprinkled a handful of dust on his turban as a sign of humility before God, and entered the great church. He walked to the altar and ordered the chanting to stop. He climbed the pulpit and proclaimed the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. In that moment, the Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The Ottoman Empire was extinguished. The aftermath was a tectonic shift for the world. The scholars who fled the city carried with them the ancient Greek manuscripts, Plato, Aristotle, the lost sciences. They fled to Italy, fueling the fires of the Renaissance. The trade routes to the east were now firmly in Ottoman hands, forcing the Europeans to look west, across the Atlantic, sparking the age of exploration. Constantinople was renamed, eventually becoming Istanbul. It became the capital of a new empire that would span 3 continents and last until the 20th century. But as we look back on 1453, we must see the moral weight of this event. The fall of Constantinople teaches us that nothing in history is permanent. The Theodosian Walls were thought to be eternal, yet they fell to new technology and human determination. It reminds us that civilizations do not die of old age. They are dismantled, piece by piece, by the ambition of the new. Constantine XI represents the dignity of the old world, standing tall against the inevitable. Mehmed II represents the ruthless efficiency of the future. History does not choose sides. It only chooses survivors. The tragedy of Constantinople is not that it fell, but that for the new world to be born, the old one had to be utterly destroyed. Today, if you walk the back streets of Istanbul, you can still find sections of those old walls. They stand as silent witnesses to the day the earth shook, and the Middle Ages vanished in a cloud of cannon smoke. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history and walk the battlefields that defined our world, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are digging up the past one story at a time.